The show, in organizing the show for HMAC, is that I've been privileged to know his work ever from the early 90s when he was doing somewhat abstract work and did some elements of the figure as proxy through I think the shoes that he was using. And I remember seeing those shows in some of the galleries in Houston. And then seeing his work progress, I had a show, and I'm not trying to brag about it, I had a show at the Contemporary Museum in 1990, and David was a guard there. And that's how we started up our friendship. And then about 8 years later, he had a one-person show there. And then I came in to see the show, and then we took that exhibition to our gallery at UTA, where this show is actually going to travel to after the venue here, and it'll be opening in January. But it's been kind of a privilege to see the growth of his work. And besides this exhibition, I assume most of you already know that he had a show at Texas Gallery in September. And that show was a departure for him for the reason that many of us know the work that we see in this gallery, which is more figurative and dealing with subject matter that we all have known him for. But the show at Texas Gallery involved abstraction. And there are two parts of kind of abstraction, one gestural and one hard edge. Yet the hard edge work, even though it was abstract, still dealt with the figure again. And the gestural had elements of the figure, but again, much more abstract. And this show kind of in a sense acts as I think of it as a trilogy of works that you're seeing in the last couple of months. So one of the questions I have is that are you able to, in a sense, balance to do these different kinds of work simultaneously sometimes?
But I think what ties that kind of thinking for me is a consistency of subject matter. And that subject matter can be funneled through a variety of different styles. I mean, this is nothing new in art. Musicians do this all the time. But I think for painters, it seems a little bit more complicated because of the signature nature of American looking, where in the art world, the capitalistic powers to be bank on a person's style remaining the same in order to be recognized and to sell it. And it's frowned upon they don't have this problem in Europe, but in this country it seems that painting has sometimes taken on a fashionable idea of picture making because you are recognized by this continuum. Well, the point of art is freedom. And the freedom belongs to you, and you don't have to audition for it. My subject matter is based on the authentic nature of what I choose to paint about. And once I'm clear of that choice, it doesn't matter to me what guides the final outcome, what the result is. So, it's not how you paint, it's what to paint. You know? And so I think once you figure out what to paint and what and why that object deserves to be in the world, I think that's half the battle.
The first works that I've known as far as works on paper, the Jupiter Jive series. And then these works, I guess with the Ready-Made Africans, was kind of the beginning of these works on paper. What for me was surprising was the development of working with watercolor mostly on paper, whereas you had been known for doing large-scale enamel-based paintings, and then going to something a little bit more intimate, but yet the subject matter is still, in a sense, very kind of confrontational in the way you approach it, and still dealing with issues that you've always dealt with before. Can you kind of describe, what kind of made you want to explore the watercolor media and paper, because I think it has a resonance as far as how you approach it. It's very different from your paintings.
Right, right. I think this happens because, for me, I wanted to have an intimacy in my work that I felt that at that point I didn't have. My whole idea of paper, and we've talked about this before, and I think some people have heard me say this before, is the whole idea of trying to get the literary aspect in my work more in tune to how I've been influenced by literature. Somebody told me that most people come to themselves by the age of 12. What you think about what you're going to be doing for the rest of your life hits the apex at like 12 or 15. This might be true, because the things I was interested in as a child has never changed at this current age. My level of interest has stayed the same. Reading and literature is such an intimate thing, especially the reading of the physical aspect of holding books. Now technology has changed, and I'm not going to go into this thing about my feeling about how technology has made us an untactile society, which I think it has. The whole feeling of being in the present has been abstracted by the complications of the screen, on screens. But books, and the holding of a book, is such an intimate thing. It sets the pace, your own body politic pace, differently. I wanted that in my work, which I didn't have in the big paintings at that time. And I learned, and I wanted that based on my interest in reading, poetry, novels, and I'm a slow reader, which makes me a great candidate for why poetry is a big deal for me. Because I read so slowly that I can truly grasp what I'm reading. So I thought that and this came to me really late, because I was in Paris and I saw some drawings by Victor Hugo. And I didn't know that Victor Hugo had made works on paper. And I was so struck by the beauty of these images and these watercolors. And I had saw Eugene Delacroix's sketches that he used to make, and I loved those sketches. And I had read this book, I think in the 80s, by Clarence Major, called Juba the Job. Now, this book is a book of the history of African American slavery. And it's an interesting book because it's complicated, and it has a lot of what Henry Louis Gates called in his 1985 book, The Signifying Monkey, where there's a trickster in this dictionary. It's a dictionary of words that black people use, slang terms, and the dates they were used, the dates they were used, and how they were used. I thought this was hilarious at first, but it rang true. I understood in the North and the South that African Americans had used these pieces of language. Now, Jimmy Baldwin calls this a form of fantasy revenge, these kind of inside jokes. But Gates calls it the signifying monkey. I found it very interesting. I wanted to illustrate this book because back in the 70s in Detroit, Michigan, my mother ordered me some encyclopedias. You guys know these encyclopedias. But they're books, series of books. Yes, a series of books. Read, ABC. I should have bought it. This is the best thing I've seen in my life. There was a book where things are explained in a series of pictures and whatever. I love this book because this book was a great companionship to me in my youth, and it enabled me to get out of whatever the east side of Detroit was. you can be a mental traveler. Well, Jupiter Jive was a book like that, and but I wanted to illustrate that, but it wasn't going to be possible, of course. But I started doing these Jupiter Jives. But what I started to do was I started to recast the labeling system of the image versus the text. You know, to reset how we see image, to recast how we see image, to refocus, to unbalance the viewer of how the viewer processes image, period. See, in America, we have a labeling system that is a dominant force in the culture. And you see this labeling system work in the rise of certain political figures or the continuum of race or sex in the culture. People who, it's a great Broadway play, I think, called Our Town, where, you know, in some aspects, people never leave their communities. Well, you'd be shocked how many people don't leave their communities and venture out beyond the boundaries of their communities to have a visceral experience with a thing which we call the other. So what you see on television or on any screen you have is the notion that the world is really like this. So if I do a Jupiter Jive and I have a certain image with a text, either you're going to believe that it's an illustration of the image, or you're going to be thrown off balance by the way it's being presented. I like to tell this joke. There's a painting behind it called Rothko. I'm not Rothko, but I think an issue called Dolly. I don't know if it's downstairs. Downstairs. And it was shown at the Manil collection. There's a bunch of upscale white ladies who went to see that. And after a long viewership, the other whispered to the other, I didn't know Dolly was black. and which is interesting situation.
And you go back to school.
Yeah. So people get, you know, so that's a form of literature.
Right, so in the sense though, you're also placing the word relationship to the image, but you're presenting a question actually, I think, to the viewer, but it's based on what they know or don't know.
Exactly.
And then they're kind of like, you know, they're not, sometimes in this case, they weren't sure, you know, what they were seeing.
And I've seen it work the other way around. You know, I've seen certain hip-hop images I've used with European names under that. And I've seen certain peoples of color twisting themselves to make the connection. Because word versus image is a real thing in the culture that is barely curious. You know, so I think any creative person's job is to set a set of challenges to refocus what is American looking.
Right.
You know.
One of the things that I found interesting in the Jupiter Jive series, the words that you were using seemed like they were more like written on the pieces, where the words in here in these works are actually it's like you're using certain fonts,
right,
and they're much more refined as opposed to seem like they were, even though they're hand painted, they seem like they're more like sign painting.
Yeah.
In a sense. But why the contrast there?
Well, the Jupiter Jives, original Jupiter Jives, were field notes, you know, on diaries. They were meant to be seen as diaries. These images, which the font is more refined, is my interest in filmmaking and font. I don't know, a lot of people, my friends, I love movies, and a lot of my paintings are based on movies. I've seen all kind of movies. And I would leave the theater if I didn't like the font. If I saw the font, and the font wasn't right, I said, we're getting out of here.
Is that like the beginning of the film?
Yeah. I mean, me and my friend Tierney Sylvan would just hate going to movies because they were just like, damn, we paid, you know, like $10 to see this movie. And David is like, okay, you know, the font ain't right. You know, because you can tell it's going to be, you know, screwed up movie because the font is wrong. You know. And so, this is a strange way to live life. But But
Let me ask you a question then. Have you ever stayed through a movie after you didn't like the font, like President and Terry said, no, we're gonna stay, and then you actually liked the movie?
no.
I wasn't sure. But it does seem that literature and cinema play heavily in your work. I mean, it's kind of like information that you know, that is sometimes not easily readable, because I know that in reading Gary Reese's essay on your work in the catalog, you know, he mentions, like, we talked about Fitzcarraldo.
Right.
And I actually just saw that movie again just in the last couple of weeks.
The one on Herzog.
Yeah, and it's like, he mentions that, you know, about the main character is like where you say dying opera.
Right.
And there is this kind of like operatic feel to a lot of his work, in the sense there's a grandeur about the way you approach these images. And even the fonts that you're using, that's like, they're like the film titles.
Right.
But so, can you talk a little bit about that?
I do, and I'm glad you asked that, because seriously about the fonts are thought out, you know, just as seriously, as the images are thought out. You know, I don't like to divorce the language from the image. So the font has to have something that physically gives a rhythmic section to the image. So, and my way of working is different from other people's way of working. I've been drawing this because I don't like to illustrate the subject matter before it happens. So I write everything down like a movie script. So I write it down, and if it reads the way I like it to read, I'll paint it. You know, so the fonts have their own set of writings, and I search for the fonts, and the image have it second. Now the operating nature of these images is based on a storytelling device that I've always found useful in why I choose the images themselves. So let me repeat that. I'm always interested in those stories where I'm being told the story by a person who has survived the event. Examples of this is Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, Hemingway's Sun Also Rises, Melville's Moby Dick, Shelley's Frankenstein, Dante's Divine Comedy, or even the Gospels in the New Testament. You know, I'm interested in hearing people who have survived a kind of wreckage, and the way they tell it, if it moves me, is the way I'm going to retell it. Thus the title, The Telling of the Told. You know, these stories of, and this is a tricky disposition because, you know, it's not clearly evident that what you're being told is the truth. But how it's told keeps you captured in how you proceed with those things. You know, the title of the show is called The Complications of Water, and Urban Dreads and the Complications of Water. This title derived from my interest in Moby Dick, which is complicated with water, you know, and how the whole story of Moby Dick, which I've been thinking about for 10 years, and my interest in urban planning, as far as how divisive urban planning is for people of color, and just all people, actually. This goes back to Robert Moses in the 1940s in New York City. I mean, this whole idea of how, you know, racism can be implemented based on how we are segregated in communities. And so it's a complicated show, but it talked about the same things I was talking about. And the reason why I went back to that kind of painting, because I was ready for music to get back in my painting. You know, I was bogged down in the literary aspect of my work for so long, this kind of work, which takes a long time to think about and plan. I was losing the musicality of my painting, where paint could tell the story just as well as images. Abstract is a Latin term meaning to take from. Everything is abstract. All human, the way of looking is abstract. The strange juxtapositions in these paintings doesn't give you a clear notion of what the painting is about. You know, how we read images is odd. You know, for example, and beware, mother, I'm not going to talk about politics, but I'll give you of how we think about images. You look at cable television, you look at CNN, there is a person speaking to you about what is happening. But there's strange juxtapositions of text running under that person because they can't focus on the telling of the story. They have to give you impending stories as they come in. And all these strange juxtapositions are not meant to be read as narrative. They are meant to be read as sensations. And whatever sensation you have is how you're going to process the information. You know, this is the same with these things here. You know, if you're going trying to figure out what the artist's intent is, well, that's a losing composition because it's not going to get you far. What is going to get you far is how images affect you based on how you've read other images in your life. You know, so the show at Texas Gallery freed me from not an intellectual process, but a stymied process of me wanting lyricism to get back into the work, juxtaposed to the literary nature of this work. Then I realized that I could do both. You know, I can do both. You know, I can go back and forth in whatever. You know, and that gave me a kind of freedom that you can't believe what you know before. Because you do this in your work.
Yeah. Well, I think that, you know, one of the things that David and I have talked about over the years is music. I mean, we always talk about music, I mean, we talk about other things, film and also literature, but music seems to be a real dominant factor, which is why, you know, in some ways, the work in Texas Gallery, particularly the gestural works, just seemed very, as you mentioned, lyrical. There was something there, and these works are very different. They are kind of cinematic in a sense.
Right.
But one of the things that I find interesting is that there's a layering of literature and film, and as well as art references. I mean, there's a lot of multi-layers in these works, and they're not easily accessible, in my opinion. But yet you're attracted by the way it's portrayed in the media that it's done in, and you're just kind of you're brought into the work to actually start thinking more about what is going on. But when you first see them, you just kind of like, for me, you just want to get closer and closer and start really looking them over and examining them. But at the same time, the content, and I'm saying content in a very loose term because, you know, I see layers of content that are so dense that you're not going to get an easy reading. And it might not that you ever get an easy reading, but I don't know that that's really the point.
Right.
So it's more about, in a sense, your reaction to the work, but it's also based on what you know as a visual viewer. Because in a sense, we all have a visual vocabulary, some much more developed than others, but at the same time, it's, you know, that's what we kind of are armed with when we approach these works.
Right, right. I think that's very true. Also, I think, I was thinking about this work and how certain work catches up to the times. I don't like to be a topical painter because I think that's a losing thing to do, you know. But I think, and this goes back to, this is really a message for younger artists too. When you choose a subject matter, which can take years, you know, to choose, because the thing about choice is you think that when you choose something, you know a thing. Whereas my opinion that we know nothing, you know, and so getting rid of that weight is you know, half the battle, freeing yourself up to discovery and whatever that entails. But how we choose things are important. So when you choose a subject matter, I think you should be invested in the subject. You know, try to learn as much as you can about the subject. And when you do that, the trends of fashion will easily come and go around you, and you're not anchored by that kind of thing. I say this because there's a painting right behind you called Little Red. And this painting I made, I think six years ago. And this was around the time where I was investigating my interest in Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein. Which you have to understand, Frankenstein was written from the male point of view by a woman in a time where women weren't taken, given the license to step up front. She was married to Percy Shelley, and his best friend was Lord Byron, two, hip-hop, strong poets. But she was married, and the story started as context. You can write the best ghost story. When I read it, and it was introduced to me by a woman, when I read it, I was fascinated in how great she was at the male voice. It wasn't like a lot of the period pieces of the voices of women that day. It was convincing as a male voice. There's a lot of people who can do this. Believe it or not, Hemingway speaks beautifully as a woman. There's a story by him called Hills Like White Elephants, where he talks about abortion, and that language is right on. But I wanted to recast myself as believe it or not, as a woman, talking about how women are treated cosmetically and sexually and all that things. This explains some of the nudity in the Frankenstein show, which a lot of these paintings have not been shown. But thinking about this thing here, called Little Red, I wanted to talk about the seductive nature of getting what you want. And the kind of the impactful pressures of what all that entails. Now I look at Little Red and I say, wow, this could be a book by somebody talking about this administration. But sometimes if you choose correctly, things come back around, and fashions blow in and out.
I think going back to what you talked about, tropical paintings or tropical artwork, I have a slight disagreement, because I think that there are topical works that I think still work, and say in like Goya's The 3rd of May, Picasso's Guernica. But I think that what happens a lot with artists who do topical work is they get so hung up on the subject at the time that they try to get a visceral response from the viewer and forget the formal aspects of the work that could actually make it transcend and make it much more eternal in what it's saying.
Right. And I think those two artists, and maybe we can disagree on Picasso, because I don't think Picasso really wasn't that invested in El Franco's regime as much as Goya was invested. Mm-hmm. I think Goya was invested
in Franco's regime.
Yeah, no, well, not Franco. But Goya was invested in what was going on with him at the time. I think Picasso was a little wavering, with that. But it's funny now that how there was a thing where something happened at the UN in the Bush administration where they actually covered up Guernica, based on it still had power.
It was a tapestry, wasn't it?
It was a tapestry, but the image is still
right.
It's just still right on.
Wow.
That's when Colin Powell did on that line.
The result was that exhibition, which was totally different than this,
Right.
by most standards, and totally different from what I've always thought of it as the colors, which was mostly black and white, almost entirely black and white. I've always thought of you in terms of gesture, and that's still there. I'm not sure I got the figurative element that Benito was talking about. Maybe I looked too quickly, because I wasn't able to spend a lot of time, and I won't go back and see my friends. So what was it a purging? Was it a getting out of one kind of head and into another, to go to a place where there's no distraction, where it's just, I'm assuming you want to water or close to it, but seagulls and the water and nothing. Or was it just? Hopefully.
You know, and I'm not smart enough, or my mind is not powerful enough to abstract images from my head. You know, and so to abstract yourself from the scene allows you a certain kind of clarity, but it brings other issues up too. It brings the man versus himself. You know, where you end up doing a lot of Shakespearean, like, oh wow, that wasn't that person, that was me. You know, and so you're hearing echoes of other kind of voices, you know. But at least you're setting yourself up where you can have those battles with yourself, and there's nothing around. What this does is reintroduces yourself to you. You know, now, I don't know if it makes painting any better, but it made my painting better in the sense that I saw, Cooney used to say this wonderful thing about painting, it's good to get in, but it's great to get out. Well, I didn't have the door to get out, and I was trying to find a door to get out. And once you spend that much time by yourself, you figure out what you're capable of and what you're not.
But you were still reading.
Yes, I was still, oh yeah, the books goes with me.
But the TV.
All that stuff, you know, all that stuff. And my TV viewing is based on anything that can fuel the painting work. Even movies and entertainment I like to watch is based on things that, so I can steal that from that person, you know.
It's a sponsor.
You're right. But I take my books with me because that is it sets my internal clock differently than, you know. So that was a great thing for me to do, to read. I just needed a reset button, you know, to do. Because I had thought about that show at Texas Gallery for 15 years. I thought about that show when I was teaching at RISD, you know. I thought about how to make that show, how to figure out, but I didn't know how to make it, you know. I knew what it was about, but I didn't know how to make it, you know. And I had to research how I was going to make it, you know. Not to, because that's a great, I was re-listening, I was telling my friend Scott back there in Benito, I was re-listening to the music of Dizzy Gillespie recently, a genius of 20th century music, a genius of progressive sound, and him and Charlie Parker being the originators of bebop. But he said something the other day that I found incredibly illuminating. He said, well, you couldn't play that music if you wasn't technically precise enough to do it. You know, and people in the band said, well, you couldn't play. See, people look at improvising and all this other stuff as some kind of free form of escapism, or in painting, they talk about, you know, zombie abstraction and all this kind of stuff. Well, Dizzy says, well, you know, you would have to be an incredible, everybody who played had to be incredibly technically astute at playing. Right? I figured out how to play, you know, but that doesn't make great art, being technically astute, you know. So everything had to work with all that, you know. So what I chose to paint, once I figured out how to paint it was pleasurable. And loneliness helps with that.
So, kind of following that, going to Bauer, it seems like there was a period of self-examination and self-evaluation.
Right.
Was it as a result of being there that you started formulating the approach to the work that was seen?
Of course. And once I figured that out, I can go back into an urban situation and implement, you know, that story, you know. Because I just needed to hear the opposing opinion in me. You know, and once, and like I said, that's a dangerous place to be too, because you can get distracted. Spending time by yourself is distracting. You know, but once I figured that out, I was able to figure out what, especially the Urban Dread series was going to be. You know, and implement that.
That to me was even more of a departure, because that to me just comes out of nowhere, even though, in a sense, in the fonts and how you paint the fonts in these pictures, the hard-edged, abstract quality of those works were something I probably would never have expected of you.
Right.
The subject matter, I would have, but not the way you approach those paintings.
Right. Well, because the thing that I found interesting about that show is that I can push my ideas of who I am as an African American through any prism of modernism. Nothing can stop how I feel about stuff like that. So, and that's a confidence I have about how sincere I am about the subject matter I chose. I can, if you don't like this, well, I can paint it the way you like it. But it's still about what I'm talking about. A woman saw one of those urban dreads, one of these black and white paintings and stuff, and some girl said, well, it's about, this and that. And then she said, oh, that's such a shame, it's so beautiful too. And so it's funny how people do that, But I was that's that signifying monkey of the spirit. I could, passing through different kinds of things, and there's a freedom to that too.
But it's interesting that comment that was made. It also again goes back to the relationship of the viewer with their visual vocabulary, what they know, and then what they bring to in a sense, the conversation. I always see his artwork as being the conduit of a conversation between the artist and the viewer.
It is.
But it's like everybody's bringing something different, but that work itself is really.
Yeah, it's very true. I think the biggest mistake we can make of us, especially images like this is work based on African American's point of view. This is the point of view of humanity. It's a mistake to look at my paintings and say, well, there's no way in because this is about the African American experience. It is true. I am an African American brother. But I am a human being. I was, like they said, I was born before I went to school. But that's, like I said, that's a big battle. And artists who can't speak should speak about that kind of stuff.
It's been my experience that when an individual reaches a certain level of success in whatever their profession is, they become the product of the success versus them being what created the success. In terms of your art, how do you deal with that? For instance, obviously the success didn't make you who you are. Who you are made the art. The art didn't make you.
Right.
What is it about you that created this kind of work?
I'm going to have to embarrass her yet again. My mother. My mother gave me a set of constitutional values of letting me be me. Letting me be me in every aspect of the potential of me. And that is an incredible value for a young person doing what I do. To have a mother letting you draw all kind of crazy crap all over her house. With just stuff and just applauding at each stroke. Within reason. My mother has been a big deal for me in that, which I can't even begin to tell you how that has impacted how I behave. And plus, I'm not a religious person. I think all creative people are religious, but I do feel a connection to a universalness in the universe, which I feel I pledge allegiance to. That, like I said earlier, I used to state when I was born before I went to school, I knew exactly who I am. It's like what James Baldwin used to say, you don't tell me, I'm telling you, I know exactly who I am. my family knows exactly who I am, so when I carry on, you know, I hear it and from this guy too. But, so whatever happens to people like, this might be controversial, I have to say it. Whatever happens to people like Jean-Michel Basquiat, or people reach a level kind of fame where they're cast into a hotbed of things where you're not mentally prepared to deal with all that stuff. Maybe there's a foundation that you can have to deal with that kind of stuff. So I think in my case, my foundation was set, you know, and I knew how to behave within the parameters of my gifts, you know. And you didn't know, like Derek Jeter said, you don't want to disappoint your parent, you know. And that's all that answer.
Perfect, thank you.
Timely versus timeless. Everyone now deal with today's political climate, what's going on today. Or you'll hear about a musician, they'll say, well, that was before its time. We listen to 50-year-old music now, and it seems apropos. The Gil Scott Heron's thing,
Right.
The Last Poets, those things seem politically apropos for today.
Mm-hmm.
How do you look at your work 75 years from now? And the timelessness of that work. How does David McGee in 75 years come back and look at and look at these paintings? What do you think about you then?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think it's a good idea to think about it now, you know, in the making of the work now. I think that can be a kind of, that can be an end game where you don't want to come in, because that brings a kind of ego which you can't afford amongst the living, you know what I'm saying? So, only thing I can do to guarantee that, if that happens at all, is that the truth that is injected into the work, when I pass that work again, I say, oh yeah, I can deal with that. You know, I mean, some of these pieces that I haven't seen for 10 years, and I'm not embarrassed by them. You know, so that is something that's not up to me to think about now, but if the work is authentically true, and it's made with the purity of truth, it'll take care of itself. You know, and if it doesn't, then I'll be dead anyway. So what the hell I care? You know. But
I don't have to worry about that.
yeah. You know, but you know, like I said, you know, the work that from like Gil Scott Heron or any from Bob Dylan to Charlie Parker, you know, you pray that somebody would look at your work, you know, like Walt Whitman says, years from now, and get something from it. You know, I'm just happy that people look at it now and get something from it. You know, but if it's made with truth, it'll take care of itself. I pray it does, though. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Oh, Sam.
And you talked about the juxtaposition of the text and font to the visual composition that are associated with it, how energy and difference is exercised in each of these works. But you haven't talked, as I haven't heard you talk, about your composition of the visual composition, how you decide which elements will be striking each other in the visual component of this work or Rembrandt, or how each of those visual elements was decided.
Right.
Try others and experiment with different images. How does that happen?
You know what, man, that comes based on my interest in the graphic novel nature of how these things are composed. In graphic novels, in some cases, the image does tell the story. That is a longer process for me to figure out, you know, and that's why my own writing helps it a lot, you know, because I figured that if I put one image next to another image, well, that stands for a piece of language in how people read the entirety of the image. So it depends on what the image is and how I want people's eyes to navigate through. Like in the show at Texas Gallery, I knew that I want people to move. I wanted them to navigate in a straight lyrical line and walk down that whole corridor. In some of these, I do want I know how to push and pull images with color, where I know, because I know how people, I know how color affects people. I know how people look at certain colors as opposed to other colors. And so if I put something, you know, hot next to something cold, I know you're gonna look at the hot and then go to the cold and then try to get some relief somewhere. So it depends what the image is. You know, the images navigate the composition of how these things are composed. You know, and that takes a little time, you know, to figure out, you know, what the whole subject matter is going to be. But all that is based on the choice of images. So the choice of images.
But is it hit or miss? You try to.
Oh yes, a lot of hit. There's a lot of hit and misses.
Combination.
Yeah, and watercolor, because watercolor is such a tender medium and somewhat expensive. You want to get it right the first time. You know, it's a strange form of fresco painting. When I first started doing watercolors, this may be different from Benito. It was a process. It was a process for me to figure it out because the way I do watercolors, you know. So I had to get it right the first time because, not just the expenses, but the time you would put into one piece. So I would map everything out with a sentence structure of how I wanted things to be, you know. And now on some of these things, I would make empty blocks how I think, and then I would write in the block how the story would be told. And then I would just push it up to the wind if it would work, you know. But it's exciting that way, you know.
I think one of the things about watercolors is that it's really kind of unforgiving. I mean, it's like, you gotta do it right, because one of the things about watercolor is like, if you don't get it right, it's gonna look dead. I mean, it's gonna look flat. So you really have to, you know, do it and do it correctly. I mean, but it's all, even though you can plan it all out, it's really a very spontaneous medium. But one of the things that I find interesting in these works, unlike the Showpeople Gallery and unlike the earlier paintings, that a lot of the paper is showing, and
Right.
and there's a certain, to me, there's also a certain confidence in allowing for that, so you don't have to fill up the whole paper, as some artists do.
Right.
Or as in the show at the gallery, that, you know, those paintings are completely full.
Yeah, well, that allows the image to be illuminated. You know, in the white, the void of the white brings an intensity to what's perceived as opera, because there's no activity but the activity that you're meant to look at. And I don't use the color white, you know, so memory has to be always put in place all the time, you know.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. I love when you're talking about when you're preparing and thinking about your work, you write and
Yes.
just in structure. Where do you keep your writings, or do you sometimes some people are a designer or creating something, they'll throw that away? But
No, I keep.
you have an archive, or you probably have paper.
Yeah, I keep.
Collector like me.
Yeah, I keep it all. You know?
Yeah.
Because I can go back to it and
Yeah.
reuse it. You know.
And maybe that's why, again, you're talking about the focal point of your work. You've already given so much thought to that, so it doesn't become this place.
Oh, that is so true.
Yeah.
My next show is going to be about how one drop of black blood can affect a person
Mhm.
based on something I've been reading. And I've been thinking about that for a year now. You know, and I'm going to think about it for another 4 months. Then I'm going to write it down. Then I'm going to start. You know, that's half the process for me, which is to figure out what is it, you know, and what it is, and like, why is this thusness thus, you know? So once I figure that out, I'm going to start working on it. But and the reason why I can do that now is because I figured out how loneliness works with me now.
I'm intrigued just because I think our society wants us to always look busy. And when I started my business, it took me 5 years to figure out that I was making myself look busy and nobody was watching me.
Right.
So I was intrigued by your process of going and getting rid of the distractions. But I wonder, because of how our schools are, it's always this kind of organizational thing, you have to do things just right. Does it take you some time to kind of unwind to get to that place because you've been taught to do things certain ways?
Yeah, I think people are taught to like you said, stay busy and all that. I'm not a prolific artist. I work all the time. It takes me a long time between shows. But Stravinsky says something I always like to talk about. I wait like an insect waits. Then I'll jump. But I'll take, life happens to be busy making other plans, they say, and I wait whatever. Listen, if you're not doing that, you can do something else. And so I don't feel the need to make the paintings because there's a show happening. I don't want that kind of pressure. I want everything to be fully formed. So my time is my time. Like when Maxine Waters says, I'm reclaiming my time. So I figured out with the time I have left, I'll use it the way I want to use it to make a product that means something to me. So I'm not going to be around making keeping busy just because, people want me to, for shows, if you're ready, when it's ready.
I think we'll allow for one more question. I think we've gone over our time limit, but Melanie?
Oh, well, in that case, I have a couple. But real quick. The first one is for David, the second one is for his mom. And the first question is, I'm fascinated by the whole fonts thing, because I always thought, I didn't realize how deliberative it was for you, and that you walk out of movies because you don't like the fonts. So which comes first when you talk about all the writing? Do you have the word in mind first, or do you have the concept that you want to marry with?
The word comes first.
Okay.
The word always comes first. The image comes second. For example, in the picture, there's a picture behind you called Dora Maar. I had read a book called Surviving Picasso that my mother bought me, but then I read a book that James Lord wrote about Dora Maar and her personality. And I was interested in her personality. And so I wrote her name down in a book of mine like 5 or 6 times, just the name. But then I wanted to recast her, not as the victim of Picasso, but as a kind of 1970s black exploitation film from the 1970s, starring Pam Grier.
Right, Pam Grier.
Right? So you ever seen that Quentin Tarantino movie called Foxy Brown?
Yeah.
Where Pam Grier's kicking all that ass in there? I wanted Pam Grier to be like Dora Maar on the comeback with Picasso in her sights. You know what I'm saying? And that's what it looks like, And it looks like it can be a movie, Dora Maar starring Pam Grier. Yeah. So the word comes first.
So the question for your mom, when did you know that this wasn't just ramblings, that he wasn't just messing around, but that he had a serious talent, and how did you encourage that without sometimes being a little horrified?
The part you asked me about encouraging him.
Well, encouraging him even when sometimes the images were not something that you were particularly happy with. And I'm sure that's true even today.
Well, the truth is, he's never painted an image that I was unhappy with.
Okay. Well, there's your
Everything that he's ever done, he's explained it in a way where even if I did feel a little iffy, by the time he finished, I had his point. And so, yeah.
But they'll be around for a few more minutes, and there is a catalog of the exhibition that's available downstairs, and I'm sure if you want, you could probably get David to autograph it. So again, thank you for coming out, and thank David for being here.
inspires the baby's questions. What's that?